Very pleased to be able to be here with all of you to provide some of the insights that we've gathered, the key takeaways from the revised MAS Technology Risk Management Guidelines. So the MAS Technology Risk Management Guidelines, the last iteration was really established in 2013. And it's really at the start of this year that we saw a renewed set of risk management guidelines that have been established by MAS. Now, what we saw from 2013 was the 2013 version was clearly one of a more prescriptive set of controls that were advocated throughout the banking and finance sector. And with the latest revision, while most of the thematic areas are still the same, there are elaborations into new areas, as well as direction towards a more principle-based outcome in the way the guidelines are laid out. Now, without further ado, I think it's really to call out some of the key takeaways that we have established, which are thematic in nature. With our review of the 2021 January Technology Risk Management Guidelines, we've basically identified 12 key areas that have significant changes or areas that should be paid attention to. This is the broad overview. I will go through them one by one. Now, first and foremost, it's the involvement of senior management in cybersecurity initiatives. Now, where we started in the journey in 2013 in the banking and finance sector in Singapore, clearly from a compliance perspective, there was a lot of attention because of the risk of penalties that may come from the MAS, which is the regulator. But that is coming from the general understanding of compliance and risk management. Now, going forward, clearly, as we are now having more cybersecurity attacks, more intricate supply chain that are really necessary, as well as the leadership layers. And that's why there is the advocacy with these new guidelines towards ensuring that there is a senior cybersecurity professional that really understands what all these cyber implications mean. And that also enables the senior management as well as the board to be able to then set the tone, culture, as well as direction in terms of how cybersecurity should be laid out in the organization. Just a quick layout of these slides, you will see some consistent features. One is the references that we have made in relation to the 2021 January Technology Risk Management Guidelines. So with the slides, if you are trying to follow, that is how you can take note of it. I'll move on to the next one. I think the supply chain risk management becomes an even more elaborate focus area. MAS has been quite forward-looking since the past, even before these renewed technology risk management guidelines. We have the outsourcing risk management set of guidelines that we know, and MAS has collectively with the Association of Banks Singapore have come up with a lot of guidance and direction towards how this can be better managed. Now, with the renewed technology risk management guidelines, we see the need for the banks and institutions to really pay attention towards the conducting of risk assessments on third parties to ensure that they meet security standards, the vetting of these vendors to be able to ensure that security risks that are introduced by the third party is considered upfront and continuously monitored. So on the overall, as we are also mindful of the context that or threat environment that we're operating in just a couple of months back, we clearly would be very familiar with the topics of SolarWinds, Orion that was being taken advantage of or exploited for deep supply chain compromise to the targeted parties. Following close step was the discovery of Exelon, which is the file transfer application. And more recently, in the last few weeks, we know of the outcomes of the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities that were very exploited. And these are all related towards the supply chain. Now, to bring a bit of context for us in the local environment, when we look towards supply chain, in a broader or more international lens, there is a focus that the supply chain relates to the software and hardware of that is being used in the organization that is provided by external parties. Now, however, in the localized context, when we talk about supply chain, there is an aspect of vendor risk management involved as well. So in that collective space, we are really looking at the products and services that organizations take or receive from service providers. So there is that clarity. In that sense, I would repeat again, there is the services component, and for products that it's broken into two parts, which is the hardware and the software. When we move on to the next one, clearly as there is a drive in the banking and finance sector towards more digital services offering, we also see a lot more about the inclusion of fintech solutions and clearly advocacy towards building out the fintech industry. This need for agile development and DevSecOps become larger than where it was in the past. Clearly, we've moved on from the traditional waterfall development approaches, leading towards these agile development cycles, and the embedding of security concerns into the development and operations cycle is very important. So not too different from where it was in the past, moving towards a secure development lifecycle is clearly important. And ensuring that security is embedded throughout the life cycle, especially where you are now going towards a more short-term or short-time requirements in terms of developing new functions, features, and changes to your applications. So all those need to take into consideration and build it into your secure development lifecycle away from the traditional waterfall approach, where in the waterfall approach, you have very specific milestones of specification, analysis, design, implementation, and testing. Now you have all of this done in a quick step. Maybe within a day, you're going through 2 iterations of a function development or a change development cycle. Now, how do you actually embed cybersecurity into that context? That's where there is the advocacy towards establishing a framework as well as development practices that include security in that context. The next part, as we emphasize about the digital services that banking and finance is really going towards, is this API security. Now, API security is also important, especially for the move towards cloud services. Now, cloud services, clearly there are many different formats. There's infrastructure as a service, there's software as a service, and the list goes on. API security really looks towards the kind of services, software services that you may be providing, whether is it developed by yourselves or by some third party. How does that actually embed cybersecurity principles towards that? And with that, you need to look at your supply chain really to evaluate whether these external parties can align to the cybersecurity risk appetite that you have as an organization. How do you actually lay out the API access controls? And how often do you actually review this and ensuring that you have a process to maintain these security standards? So there is a lot of elaboration in this TRM, listing out security mechanisms such as key aging, encryption, logging, session control, and the list goes on. More details are in the TRM itself. Now, clearly with banking and finance, your closest extension beyond IT would actually be the use of cloud as well as the Internet of Things. So these could be devices, ATM machines, that would be the closest approximation to the Internet of Things. But with virtualization, that's really on the cloud-enabled services where you have containers, you have virtual machines and so on. So clearly with the more mature state that we are in compared to 2013, now we understand a bit better in terms of what are these different components, the likes of hypervisor security, host security, guest operating system security, and so on. Now, with this TRMG, this version of the TRMG, there is the explicit call out for access control. as well as inventory of the devices that are being deployed for your digital enabled services. In particular, with regards to IoT devices, there's the advocacy on ensuring that these devices are hosted on separate and secured networks away from your most critical infrastructure, for example. And that if there is a need for such interactions, that they are risk managed with the relevant controls in place. More importantly, to pay attention towards the sensitivity of the data, more predominantly addressed by personal identifiable information, or PII, as well as financial transactional data. On cybersecurity operations, I think there is that need and advocacy towards more involved threat information sharing. And I think this really is to advocate towards sectoral situational awareness, where the collection of data today exists largely in the organizational level. There is that advocacy for organizations in the sector to really collect, share, and help each other improve on their responses towards events that may be observable within one organization, but through sharing, discover that other organizations might be under similar, if not the same threat. And this extends beyond the building of a security operations center or the procurement of a managed security service, and be able to share these insights across the sector more widely. Now, there is also that deliberate advocacy towards cyber threat intelligence monitoring services, as well as a little bit of analysis to be able to contextualize the threats to the individual organization. And these will also add on to help manage misinformation as well as reputational matters. Some other extended considerations with regards to cyber operations or cyber monitoring also include the advocacy towards behavioral and analytics. So the likes of your user entity behavioral analytics solutions to be considered in cyber monitoring. What has been elaborated here in terms of the cybersecurity assessments and exercises, I think more importantly is the exercises. It is quite well known that the MAS collaboratively with the industry and the Association of Banks in Singapore conduct the Raffles series, exercise Raffles series. And I think it's really to encourage organizations to perform them on themselves. In the effort towards scenario-based exercises to contextualize for the organization and the whole of business perspective. So the Raffles exercise, typically, as it has been run for several rounds, has been focused on the sectoral response nature. But with this listed inside this version of the TRMG, there is that advocacy for organizations to also adopt similar approaches for themselves and having a whole of organization standpoint. Now, what does whole of organization standpoint really mean? Traditionally, we always see exercises to be conducted more towards incident response. But as we are seeing that most of the businesses are moving towards digital offerings and being more digitally enabled, the components of the wider organizations such as disaster recovery, business continuity, crisis communications and crisis management come into play. And with such cyber-related situations blowing up in terms of the larger business impact, there is a need for integrated response where maybe HR will be part of the process, engaging internal stakeholders. Your corporate communications will then deal with the public reputation and so on and so forth. So that wider consideration needs to be put into play. Now, other forms of cyber assessment and exercises that are being advocated as well could be adversarial attack simulation. And these, the buzzword in the market has always been breach attack simulation or red teaming exercises. With this TRMG, it's really encouraging organizations to go through a more effective or efficacy-based assessment of that. Now, being a consultant in the industry for a number of years, many interpretations of such adversarial attack simulation exercises actually exist, of which the more advanced thinking around it seems to be what I coin as Pentest Plus. Now, with this articulation in the TRMG, it is really to go towards something that is threat informed and actually uses a well-known attack scenario to really play out and evaluate whether an organization actually could be susceptible to it or not. And with that, it really calls for the organizations that are considering this space to see whether there are opportunities to allow more production-related testing, so that the outcomes are more relevant to your actual day-to-day operations. Now, clearly, this also requires a lot more engagement with the vendor, the independent vendor that you might be working with to conduct such exercises, but it will clearly be more effective in ensuring that your day-to-day operations and the recommendations that may be laid out are useful in your cyber defense posture. The next is really in terms of secure online financial services. I think where we started in 2013, thereabouts, digital banking and digital services was really coming up and not so much in proliferation. Today, I think all of us do the majority of our banking needs through an app or through the internet banking service. And it is with the new environment, the new threat environment that we're operating in, that we need to be mindful of what kinds of threats are we facing today. In this, TRMG is really advocating more protective controls towards the risk levels that each service and application being provided for. So there's a bit more business appreciation towards that. And how the different controls, for example, secured communication channels, how do you ensure that your application is available, commensurate to the level of interaction that you're expecting, and how wide the distribution would be. Other guidance that have come up in this TRMG is really about ensuring that there's the opportunity to monitor for phishing campaigns, the protection from common attack vectors, many of which are laid out in existing industry good standards such as the OWASP Top 10 and so on. Next, we look at the acquisition process for your systems, which really is after the products, that is the software and hardware. So this really is with the shift of all the supply chain risks that we are observing internationally, globally, where threat actors are now taking advantage of the supply chain to really launch attacks and reach their eventual targets. In this respect, the new TRMG is really looking at ensuring that the vendor evaluation process is a mandatory step, and there is a reasonable level of due diligence that is commensurate to the criticality of the system in accordance to the business activity that is involved in. And with that evaluation to lay out the necessary security controls to be able to address the risks involved and to reach the appropriate risk appetite that the organization is willing to take. And all these really leads towards whether the software or hardware needs to be aligned towards your organization's own standards and practices or any other higher industry good practices. In this respect, when it comes towards software, there is this encouragement towards the source code to be contractually secured between the banking and finance institution as well as the vendor providing the software. From an incident management standpoint, I think there is this perennial problem of shadow IT. Just to elaborate a little, shadow IT is the IT assets, the computers, the laptops, maybe your VoIP phones and whatnot, that are connected to your infrastructure, your enterprise network, but are not necessarily documented in terms of any asset inventories. So in these contexts, the TRMG really advocates for the ability to detect and monitor for shadow IT, which also leads towards the inventory, ensuring that your inventories are kept up to date, and that includes shadow IT in that context, so that it no longer becomes shadow. And for a risk appreciation in terms of what these categories of IT assets, they may not be your core infrastructure, what do they create in terms of the impact should they be compromised towards your enterprise systems, and any non-approved applications should be actually documented and assessed. Now, the non-approved applications is an interesting area. Since 2013 to today, there are more opportunities for business users to create applications without significant programming understanding. In the most simple appreciation of this kind of applications could be your Excel sheets, where you put in simple rules and functions inside your spreadsheets, your workbooks, to be able to then create an outcome. A slightly more advanced one would be the likes of using simple scripts, VB script, for example, in your Word documents, your Excel files, to be able to do some level of automation in your day-to-day BAU activities, business as usual activities. Now, with all these small applications, it is seldom thought of a need to perform penetration tests, for example, or vulnerability assessments, despite that in some organizations, there are very elaborate business user applications that may pull data or even send data to very structured repositories and databases. So with this kind of emerging class of applications, the latest TRMG is also advocating that some attention be paid there, and that they are risk assessed to be able to have the necessary controls to commensurate with the risk appetite of the organization. Now, lastly, the incident management processes, and this is quite aligned to the earlier topic about how scenario-based exercises should also be performed, that the incident management process should actually be very clearly defined, and that all the different stages of response are identified and structured in such a way that everyone knows their different roles and responsibilities. And these will actually bring the level of resilience and readiness to respond for the banking and finance sector to a higher level. Now, the asset management, we've talked a bit about it with the shadow IT. The same goes for your not so shadow IT. So the key assets that you really require in the enterprise. So to go beyond the inventory, which at the most basic level, it's your procurement bill of materials, where you are buying all the hardware and all the and software and all the components, the licenses are actually documented. But to go to hopefully go to a more granular detail, as in the industry, we are advocating towards software bill of materials, for example, that may actually call out an inventory of, say, for example, the open source components that any given commercial off-the-shelf product may actually rely on in the development of their solution. It will also go down to any other proprietary components that may be dependent on as a part of that asset inventory. So all these asset inventory should then be clearly classified and governed through an established asset management policy, laying out the different cybersecurity controls that are necessary to be able to protect these assets according to their risk classification. And the roles, responsibilities through a RESI metric should actually be established for the different risk classifications of the identified asset. Next is really in terms of evaluating an organization's IT resilience and monitoring performance. So having that opportunity for periodic review of your system network architecture to determine whether there are any design or architectural weaknesses, and ensuring that these layout, these designs are actually commensurate with your business requirements through deliberate testing. And that periodic approach should also be supplemented by continuous monitoring capabilities, whether it is with your in-house capabilities or with your service providers, for example, a managed security services provider, ensuring that they have the right capacity to monitor the volume of information that reasonable monitoring needs to be established. And all these should be defined into a set of processes and procedures to be able to handle the situations, especially if the capacity is not right. So by and large, when we look towards continuous monitoring, many organizations have different interpretations of what that means. But continuous, basically, for me, in a simplistic term, would be 24/7. And in that sense, how are you actually handing over your resources to be able to ensure this level of continuous monitoring, ensuring that the capability of your people to be able to pick up the necessary indicators and be able to act on them. That's really what this IT resilience and monitoring performance really is after. With that, I've come to the end. We do have some market materials that you can leverage, and I encourage all of you to reach out to the email as shown on screen to be able to receive some of our guides in relation to the latest MAS-TRM guidelines.